Welcome to episode 45 of the Camerosity Podcast, the world's one and only open source film photography podcast. My name is Mike Ekman, and we have got a great show for you. But before we get to that, let's do some introductions. First up, from the land down under, our own Aussie man himself, Mr. Theo Panagopoulos. What have you been up to lately, Theo?
Interesting enough, I've been shooting Mamiya 7, which is very on topic for this episode.
Next, from Gainesville, Florida, where the gators are large, the rockets are tall, and the swamps are huge, is Mr. Anthony Rue. What has the weather been like down by you?
You know, this is our last gasp of winter, so it was around 45, 50 today. It was beautiful, cobalt blue skies. I wish I was out shooting. Unfortunately, I spent the day chained to an espresso machine. But I think that by Wednesday, I'm going to have the ability to go up to the Okefenokee Swamp up in Georgia with the G617 and go shoot some panoramas of some Georgia swamps.
And finally, from Yellow Springs, Ohio, the Midwest source for used cameras, lenses, filters, and 2X teleconverters is Mr. Paul Reibold. Have you ever sold anything to anyone famous, Paul?
You know, I did sell Anthony a camera, and I suppose that counts, though I wish he would stop mentioning that G617. My heart still hasn't completely recovered that loss.
Oh, it's so bad.
It's sad.
All right, last week was a lot of fun. We had a blast talking to Dan Tamarkin about auctions, 6x17 cameras, and a certain German camera brand. For episode 45, we're going back to a Japanese brand, the one, the only Mamiya. With us from the City of Lights, Las Vegas, Nevada, home of MamiyaRepair.com, is Mr. Bill Rogers. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Hi, nice to be here.
Why don't you introduce yourself? Maybe tell us a little about your history with Mamiya, your website, promote yourself a little bit.
Well, I've been repairing Mamiyas now for about 42 years. I started repairing them in the late 70s. My site is MamiyaRepair.com. Basically, these days, I repair pretty much all the Mamiya models. I've got pretty much all the parts and service materials, factory tooling to bring them back to specs. And
awesome.
And that's about it. Most of my stuff now, I publish on Instagram, and I do a lot of posts on there, and I go through the details of the repairs, which folks like to see their cameras taken apart, explained what's going on with the repair.
Well, it seems like Mamiya is a hot topic, as it's been with our past few episodes. We have a lot of people in the waiting room, so I'm going to start letting them in.
Oh, my.
It's standing room only.
Yeah.
Jeez, can't get them in the door.
My screen's not big enough.
Did we ever consult with the fire marshal to see what the occupancy is of this show?
I think the room's about as full as it can get.
Yeah. Well, I am not going to go through the entire list. We have a loaded house. We have some returning callers. I see Mr. Cheyenne Morrison. I see Ira Cohen. I see Bob Rodoloni. I see Marcy Merrill. Mike Amati. Mike, welcome to the show. I've been talking to you recently, and you were pretty excited to hear Mamiya.
How you guys doing? Glad to be here.
Awesome. Stephen Lederman, welcome to the show. Andrew Smith is back. Larry Effler's back. Brian Howard, Chris Saunders. The Zoom attendance is bouncing around, so it's kind of hard to do this in order. But we have Bill Rogers here from MamiyaRepair.com. Bill's located in Las Vegas, Nevada. He introduced himself already. He's been doing this for over 40 years. I know a lot of you guys are real excited about Mamiya. They are one of those brands that, in my opinion, kind of did everything. We've touched upon them in the past. We've never really done a deep dive on the show before. I had a trivia question many episodes ago. I think Mamiya made more 35 millimeter SLRs with different mounts than any other camera company. Nikon F mount, they made multiple proprietary mounts. They've done variations of the M42 mount. A lot of people love their TLRs with the interchangeable lenses and shutters. You know, the big C series. Gosh, there's the 645s, there's the 6.7s. I got to be honest with you, Anthony, help me out. Where should we start here?
I think that we should start at the beginning with the Mamiya folders.
Okay.
You know, because those are the ones that probably interest me the most, and that I also know the least about.
That's the one I just shipped off to you, Mike. It's on its way.
Yeah. So Mike is loaning me a Mamiya 6. It's a V, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, V. It shoots both 6.45 and 6x6.
Awesome.
And I just have to make a comment that across the Zoom screen, people are holding up the Mamiya 6 folders for us to all see. So we got more than a few here that are ready to talk about that.
For history, though, honestly, I'm going to go back to Bob Rotoloni here. Bob obviously is the Nikon guy, but he has told me a couple stories about the state of the Japanese photo industry immediately after the war and the challenges there was with firing glass. And Mamiya, if I'm correct, was the first Japanese camera maker to resume production right after the war, right? Is that right, Bob?
It's possible. It's kind of gray back then, but it's possible, yeah. Canon supposedly started up pretty early.
Yeah, I've got a Japanese camera article from 1949 with pictures of them firing the glass. So that's pretty good evidence that was very shortly after the war that they were producing optical glass. Probably one of the first.
Japan is an island and they have limited resources. Their infrastructure was completely decimated. The United States had a vested interest in rebuilding their industry to try and infuse some money to fix all this stuff. So I know that there was Fuji, there was Nippon Kugaku, and who else had glass back then? Who would have been able to make cameras in 47 or 48?
Well, Olympus made the glass for the that was used on most of the Mamiya 6 folders. My Mamiya 6V IV, Mamiya 6.4 is marked made in occupied Japan, and it's the oldest made in occupied Japan camera that I've seen.
Yeah.
And I believe mine was 1948 or 49, maybe.
Typically, the occupied Japan labels were applied around that time. By 1950, they generally had stopped. So
Nikon was making glass before the war, and they were making glass during the war, and they started to make glass right after the war because the Ojai factory in Shinagawa was not damaged by the war. So they were able to start up right away. As a matter of fact, they made all of Canon's glass up to 47. So all those Canons that were being made in 46 and 47 were coming with Nikon glass, just like they did before the war. So Nikon's glass making ability was actually ready to go from day one. Their only problem is they couldn't get some of the raw materials to make some of the glass, some of the types of glass, plus they were having trouble with power. The furnaces were gas powered, and most of the gas lines had been destroyed during the war. So they had trouble getting reliable energy sources to run the furnaces on a 24-hour basis. But they were making glass by 46. They didn't make glass for themselves.
Late in World War II, I think it was like 1943 or 44, the Germans sent a submarine to Japan, and I read the cargo list, and half of the cargo was shot glass.
Yes. There's actually a story about how they literally towed it behind the submarines, the glass, all the way to Japan. The Japanese used a lot of shot glass, but Nikon only had to get a little bit of their glass from shot. They were able to make their own. They started making glass in the late 20s. Fortunately, their factory was not destroyed, so they were able to start up right away. Their problem was raw material and power, gas. So they started off slowly. But by 46 and 47, they were making glass for Canon already. So
for anybody who has a very early post-war Mamiya 6, you can find them with a huge number of lenses. I've seen them with Fuji lenses. I've seen them with, honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't a few with Nippon Kugaku lenses.
There are.
Yeah.
There are Mamiya 6s out there with Nippon Kugaku Nikkor lenses on them. Yes.
That's got to be very, very rare because the ones that I encounter obviously most often are the Zuko lenses, the Olympus lenses. And I have my latest one, the Automat, which is the last in the line, was the Mamiya made glass, which I think was the same. I think they were both they were all Tessar designs. But the Zuko glass was excellent. But I would love to see one with some Nikon glass. That would be a super rare.
I've never owned one. But I have a friend in Ireland that has one, or I have another friend in Japan that has one. They're very uncommon.
You could get Nippon Kugaku Nikkor lenses in Aries, TLRs.
Yes, TLRs.
We know Asahi did their lenses in the Mini 6s.
Nikon was working when they were working on the Nikon 1, the original Nikon 1 in 46 and 47. They had another camera on the drawing board at the exact same time, which was a twin lens reflex. And they already had designed a 75 millimeter 3.5 lens for that camera, which of course ended up on the Mamiyas and the air reflexes. But the thing is, they had to ditch that camera because they couldn't make the shutter. They couldn't make a leaf shutter that was going to work. So they ditched it. They stuck with the Nikon one, which of course used a focal plane shutter, which is easier to make.
So is there a prototype of the TLR Nikon?
Yes, it supposedly, I've seen the drawings, I've seen the blueprints for it. That still exists. They supposedly made 2 or 3 of them. No one has been able to come up with it. No one, they'd still be in Japan somewhere, I'm sure, but no one's ever actually physically put their hands on one. Supposedly they assembled 2 of them. But like I say, I have seen the actual blueprints. They had the blueprints all ready to go. So,
wow.
But they had it at the last minute. They had the lens designed and everything. Like I said, the 75. At the last minute, they decided not make it because they could not produce the shutter, and nobody had shutters available at that time. Seiko and all those people weren't making shutters yet in 46 and 47, so they just dumped the whole project. Went with the 35.
That would have been amazing.
Yeah, it would have been something, wouldn't it?
Well, they had such great build quality on everything they made. I would imagine what their TLRs would have.
Yeah, they did. They were a military manufacturer for the first 30 years of their life, and they made everything the military specs.
So Mamiya is churning out the 6, which they did produce prior to the war. My records show they started making them in 1940. So by like late 45, maybe very early 46 is when they started putting together models. It's plausible it was probably a lot of pre-war parts, just kind of reassembling them. We know that you could find those early post-wars with a variety of lenses and shutters. But what was special about the Mamiya 6s? Maybe that was a little different than just any old 6x6 folder. Was there a feature or something that those cameras had that was unusual?
Well, the most unusual thing, Mike, was that the focusing was actually a movable focal plane or a pressure plate.
So instead of the lens or a helix, when you control the focus, the actual film plane moves forward and backwards, right? Is that what you're describing?
You focus with a wheel on the back of the camera, and it moves the pressure plate forward and back. And there is a footage scale on the upper right plate of the camera that shows you the distance where you're set. And it actually has a little depth of field scale with it.
Is that more accurate? Do you think that's maybe why they did that?
I honestly don't know. I know it's easier to produce because you're not moving anything on the lens itself. It's stationary.
Wasn't there something with the film pressure plate on those?
Well, it's certainly strange when you look at it, because when you look at the back of the camera, the film goes underneath the pressure plate, of course, and it has the cutout windows. So you can, on this particular model, it uses red windows for the film counter, film advance. It's a little goofy to look at, and it does vary from 645 to 6x6 on this model.
The big advantage of the movable film plane is there is no coupling between the lens itself and the rangefinder, which means that the rangefinder very rarely goes out of alignment on these, because there's not that additional complexity that comes with coupling it with the lens. The lens never moves, and there's no simpler mechanism.
That's a great segue into Bill. Bill, you obviously get quite a few of these to repair, I imagine. And are they more complex to actually work on, or are they more aligned more often than not, and they have other problems instead?
Well, usually I see them with like rangefinder adjustment issues or shutter issues. That's basically it. I don't see that many of them, and I see winding issues. But the service on those is becoming limited now because my parts are pretty exhausted for those. So I'm being real careful at taking those in for service now.
Yeah, I can tell you my repair story. I got, this is the story of my life, mint condition inbox camera. Never ever buy one of those ever again. Sent it.
How many plus
friend.
signs were after mint?
Yeah, sent it. This is like a recurring theme in my life. Sent it to my friend for a service, and he's serviced most of my 120 folding cameras. Really familiar with them by now after all the weird ones I send him. And he pulled his hair out doing the repairs because I don't know if it was the particular one that I had or if it's a Mamiya thing in general, because I had thought that they were pretty well, but he liked the film plane, focusing, but just repairing it was really difficult. He just said that some of the internal parts were just really poor quality steel, which of course it was just after World War II, that's natural. But in the end, it just, the one that I gave him ended up being like unrepairable. So I never even managed to shoot my one. And
Well, after the Mamiya 6, where did we go with Mamiya? Did they go strictly to the Mamiya Flex?
In 1948, they got into the TLRs and they released their first 35 millimeter camera. The original TLRs were just the Mamiya Flex, so they didn't quite have the C series that we probably think of today. So that's where I don't know this to be true unless there's somebody here that knows the corporate history a little better than I did. Mamiya was highly driven by the Americans, General MacArthur and Scap, they wanted to bring in money. So Mamiya, I think, was a willing partner to kind of just do what they needed to do. So they were sort of just releasing new models pretty quickly. They did the Mamiya Flex TLRs, which eventually gave way to the C series. They had the 35 millimeter cameras. In the 50s, those expanded to weird models like the Magazine, which had a removable film plane, a removable film back. The Mamiya Sketch Shot 24x24. I actually have a review of that coming up pretty soon for my site. But yeah, the TLR started in 48. I don't know too much of the history of where they went with that or how they came to be. Because, really nobody, when you think of the Mamiya, the C series, which does anybody have one they want to hold up? Larry's raising his hand. So you have, if you can't picture a Mamiya C series TLR, it's got the twin lenses like most TLRs would, but instead of a plate or geared lenses that spin, it has bellows. So the entire front of the camera can extend forward much further than on a typical, like a Rolleiflex could. This allows you to do close-ups. With you have extreme parallax error though, because the closer you get the lens to whatever you're taking a picture of, what you're seeing through the viewfinder isn't exactly what's going to be captured on film. But those were a whole system of TLRs where you could get pentaprism viewfinders. They had interchangeable lenses, which really it's the entire front of the camera essentially, because you're replacing the shutter, you're replacing the viewing and the taking lens as one unit. But they're very, very cool, very collectible, very heavy. I honestly don't typically take a Rolleiflex as a casual stroll camera, but the Mamiya C series are even bigger than that. I know, Mark Faulkner, you have, what is this, a 330 you let me borrow once before? That's a real nice one, but it's just heavy.
It's extremely heavy. Yeah, I've tried using it a couple times, and I just find it almost unbearably so unless you put it on a tripod.
Yeah.
Mamiya was unusual, though, in the twin lenses, because as far as I know, they never made one with a fixed lens. Can anyone correct me if that is not correct? But I don't think Mamiya ever made one that was a fixed lens.
Well, yeah, actually, the November of 56 on earlier, they were fixed. From 57, the Mamiya Flex C came out, but before that, all their models had fixed lenses from
Did they call them a Mamiya Flex?
Yeah, they call it. The first one was called the Flex Junior in 48. Then they had the Flex Automat, the Flex 1, the Flex 2, Automat B. They had a lot of models, but they weren't interchangeable lenses until 57, actually.
They were pretty run-of-the-mill. Maybe run-of-the-mill is not fair because they were well-built, but they were fairly standard Rolleiflex and Rolleicord copies initially, with the Bay 1 mounts on the lenses. They looked very similar to the Autocords, and then they eventually expanded into the C series where everything was interchangeable. But the original Mamiya Flexes, at a glance, they look just like an Autocord or a Rolleicord or Diacord. I don't know why they didn't call it a Mamiya cord.
But I think it's fair to say that once they swapped over to the C series, though, their aim wasn't the walk around TLR that Rolleiflex was aiming at. It was almost a semi studio type camera at that point, because they obviously started introducing the handle, the left hand grip, and all those kind of things as well.
Yeah, because the Mamiya Flex C, which was the first of the C series, didn't come out till 57. So you gotta try to remember what the Japanese photo industry in 57 was like, right? So that's the same year Nikon released the SP. The Leica M3 had already been out for over 3 years. Most companies were already either on the verge of or had already released 35 millimeter SLRs. So I think Mamiya kind of thought, all right, we need to do something different. Instead of just coming up with something that someone else had been doing, they expanded into the C series with the interchangeable lenses, the bellows, and I don't know how long they produced those for, but I think it was quite a while.
A few years ago, I had a chance. There was an elderly gentleman who was selling his gear, and he shows up with what looked like a small steamer case, and it was a C330 with every single lens that they'd ever made for it, with every accessory and every grip. And he wanted $500 for the case, and I just didn't think that this thing was so massive. I just couldn't imagine like wanting to shoot it that much. But he had been a Florida crime scene photographer, and this is what he would photograph. He was sort of like a Florida Ouija. This thing had gone around with his pistol grip on the side, photographing, corpses in Florida crime scenes. And I mean, just the vibes behind it were kind of heavy. But I always wondered if a lot of these cameras didn't end up in this sort of quasi-industrial use, that that because his was set up so that if it was somebody half eaten by an alligator hanging out of a bass boat, or somebody shoved in the wall of a mobile home, he'd have the right lens to be able to get the shot that they needed for the police.
I got almost exactly the same story about a Mamiya 645 TL Pro. I was doing lens hunting and looking at the Mamiya medium format lenses, and then lo and behold, on eBay pops up the same kit like Anthony said, but was the later version, the 645 TL Pro with the 80mm f2 lens, beautiful lens. And they normally go around $2,500, $3,000 for the kit. It was $600. So I sent a message to the guy. I said, "What's the story behind it?" And he said, "Well, it was a school photographer who's my next door neighbor, and he died, and his wife's asked me to get rid of all the stuff." I said, "Have a look at the lens, like yada, yada." And I just took a punt and I bought it for $600, and it was all perfect. It was probably the best camera deal I got. And amazing, but really super heavy. The side handle thing is really cumbersome. I put it in a bag and tried to take around doing some street photography. Just really difficult. It's a studio camera, or like a...
If you think of what the strength of a bellows-TLR is going to be, it's got to be close-ups, right? Being able to change focal length is obviously cool, but that's not something you're going to do out in the field, right? I mean, by the late 50s, the press cameras had already dominated. The Rolleiflex was already popular. People were already switching to 35mm SLRs and whatnot. So when you think of who might have wanted a TLR that can close focus, that's really where I think that they really shined. These were studio cameras. They probably didn't move around a ton. So like their size and weight isn't an issue at all.
They were wedding cameras too.
Yeah.
That was a huge market, was the wedding cameras. Ray Nason is in here. I see, who I think if he doesn't now, he did work for Mamiya, for Mac.
Yes, I'm still currently Mamiya America Corporation, although Mamiya was sold out to Leaf, who was bought up by Phase One. So I miss selling Mamiya cameras. I have my hands on some pretty rare cameras. I was going to try to share some photos that I found in the office. There's a prototype that looks like a Coney Omega met a Super 23. Very, very cool camera. We also have a 645J that was a gift to the owner of Mac Group from the president of Mamiya Camera. Pretty cool plaque on it. But I sold thousands of C330 cameras to wedding photographers. The in-leaf shutter was perfect for flash synchronization. The lenses were superb. Focusing, again, there's really no issue with focusing, because you had to do an awful lot of damage to the camera to have the focusing come out of alignment on that design. Yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff.
When you got to the C33 and C330, you had some parallax indicators inside the viewfinder. So for a wedding photographer, part of the several of the big shots are close-ups. The ring shot, the bouquet shot, a shot of the engraving on the invitations. So when they got to the C33 and C330 that had the parallax lines inside the finder, that really made a big difference.
They're just cool. I mean, it's if you've ever shot any camera with a waist level finder, especially medium format, for younger people who are rediscovering the art, you see that life-size image in that waist level finder, and when you could actually focus closely on something through one of these, and if you have the accessory lenses, it is really, really cool. And I could imagine those kind of cheesy, the bride's hands on the groom's fingers and their ring, that like cake pictures and stuff like that. So the flexibility, I could absolutely see how that would be, appealing to people.
And they made a device that would move the taking lens to where the viewing lens was, called a paraminder. Is that right? Anyone who knows?
Paraminder is correct, yes.
It's like a little elevator column.
There you go. Paul's got it.
Between the camera and the tripod.
Another thing to note is the earlier cameras is Nikon made a prism finder for the cameras itself before Mamiya did.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Irving Penn used one of those power adjusters all the time. I can't remember which camera he used, but yeah, the power adjuster is really clever.
I don't believe anybody, any other camera manufacturer ever made a interchangeable lens TLR. And to me, that was the most interesting thing about the Mamiya C series, is that it was the only TLR with interchangeable lenses that I'm aware of.
Sony Omega made one as well.
Oh, they did?
The Sony Omega Flex.
Yep.
Yeah, the Sony Omega Flex.
Yep. I shot weddings with those.
There's that Peter Goland camera.
We're getting. Yep.
Oh, Golan Flex. Yeah.
We're getting into the weeds, though. Those are pretty obscure. The big Coney TLR, though, would be the one that I would have thought of too. But it's definitely safe to say, though, that you ask 100 collectors to tell you the name of an interchangeable lens TLR, I'd be willing to bet most of them will say, Mamiya. That's what they were known for. So they're obviously producing the folders. They're getting into 35 millimeter. They're producing the TLRs, both the solid body ones and the bellows cameras. But then eventually they expanded into the SLRs, the medium format SLRs, like the 6.7s and the 6.45s.
Before that, though, they did sorry to interrupt there, Mike.
That's okay.
Before that, though, they went into the press cameras, the Super 23s.
That's
and the
right.
Universals. Yep. They're an interesting camera. I've got one right here, which is about to break my arm holding it up.
Which one is that?
This one's the Super 23.
The 23, okay.
Yeah. And they were an interesting camera because I think they took the cues from the C series TLRs in terms of size and usability, and tried to sort of transpose it into a rangefinder to be used more in terms of press and out in the field. So these are a lot more interesting enough, more carryable than the actual TLRs themselves. But my God, these will hurt you. These will nothing's connected on this C23. You can shoot the whole roll with your dark slide in. You can not advance it. You could not pull out the 100 millimeter lens and be out of focus. And also, but the versatility of them is unbelievable. They even have a bellows inserted in the back there where you can use the ground glass to do macro work. I mean, I think, Paul, that this is one of your favorite cameras too, isn't it?
I got my first Mamiya Super 23. It might even have been a Universal in 1968. And since that date, I have never not had one. I probably owned a half dozen or more of them, but I've never not had one on the shelf. That camera with the 6x9 back and the 50 millimeter lens is just one of the great travel landscape type cameras, I think, of all time. It's just one of my favorite cameras.
There's even limited swings and tilts back there, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And oddly enough, the Universal, they made a Polaroid back for it, but the Super 23, the Polaroid back wouldn't fit. That's a crazy
Oh,
thing.
that's interesting.
So you had something with swing and tilt, which is what you have the Super 23, but the Universal had the version that you could put a Polaroid back on it. I never understood that, but
It's where the latches are, I think.
yeah,
There was a P adapter and an M adapter,
correct.
but they never made a P adapter for the Super 23.
Correct.
So, Bill, have we gotten into the models you start to see coming for repair a lot yet? Like, what's the most common stuff you see?
Well, these days I see a lot of Mamiya 7s. That's a real popular camera. My shop is always full of Mamiya 7s and 6s to a lesser extent, but I still do lots of the Universals. I probably have a half dozen here in for repair with different lenses. And of course the 645s, but the 7s right now are the hot camera. That's what everybody wants.
Bill, what about the difference between the 6 and the 7? Are you seeing any reliability differences?
Yeah, Mamiya learned from the 6 and they produced the 7, which has got improvements in the winding mechanism. The 6 had that collapsible front lens standard, and that's a weak point. I see that damaged a lot. Camera gets a little bit of impact and causes a problem. So the 7 was an improvement over the 6. Absolutely, it was.
Are you seeing now on Mamiya 645s? It seems like every one I see has got some separation in the prism.
Every one is either separated or about to separate.
Is there anything you can do with those, or is it just pretty much?
Not really. It used to be I could replace the prism, but of course that's not an option now. And even if you had old stock prisms, they'd have the same problem.
Isn't the problem with prisms desilvering that there was foam or some kind of insulation that was physically making contact with the top of it?
Yeah, on some of them, absolutely.
That's really because really the prisms, whether you're talking a 35 millimeter or a professional camera or not, there's a reflective coating that keeps the light bouncing around in there, and that foam. I mean, for anybody who's taken apart an old camera, we all know what the crumbled foam looks like, but depending on whatever that material is made out of, it essentially just eats away that reflective material. So when people say, can you fix a prism? I know you didn't say that, but that gets asked a lot. The Pentax K1000s a lot of times have bad prisms. You'll see a lot of 35 millimeter cameras. You'll see a stripe that goes right down the center of it, and that's actually the top of the prism, and it's making contact with foam or like a rubber that just essentially turns into primordial goo, and it dissolves the silver layer. And I mean, and unless somebody knows how to resilver a prism, which I don't even know if that's possible.
Yeah, my trick, the prism in that, I finally found a company. It's one of the last companies I think in the world that still do it. They do the prisms for submarines. But I think it's now like over a year for them to resilver the prism. It's just come back to me now. It's in the post.
I haven't actually done it, but I did research and go down this rabbit hole a few years ago after getting a 645 prism that has this issue. And there are a couple of scientific instrument companies in the US and one in London, I believe, that will do it. But they will resilver the prism if you ship it to them in the correct way. Assembling and reassembling the prism, meaning the entire assembly, you got to get the glass element out. And that is quite a challenge, especially in the AE and PDS finders. It involves unsoldering and resoldering wires just to be able to access it. So if you're willing to kind of do the disassembly and extract the optical element itself, there are companies that will work on that.
Well, Brian, on the standard prism, not with no electronics and not the PD or PDS or CDS, is it taped at the top or is it held on with foam? Do you recall?
I don't know. I have one actually in the back that I got partway through taking it apart to see if I could do this. I don't know the answer to that question.
Because I see a lot of them that are taped, and the tape just it dries out and it drops down. But if it hasn't damaged the silver, it seems like it should be able to be retaped, but it's reached a point where it's not really probably.
The silver is toast. It's not even usable.
And this probably also explains why waist level finders for those cameras that Mamiya couldn't give away back in the day when you were selling cameras, because how do you shoot a vertical with a waist level finder? Now everybody wants waist level finders, and they're selling for 3 times as much as they did new.
On the topic of shooting a waist level finder sideways, if you've never watched the backwards bicycle video on YouTube by Smarter Every Day, it is the perfect analogy. It's a bicycle where the handlebars are geared to go backwards from normal. So if you steer left, you turn right. Easy to explain, impossible to do, unless you spend a year or two doing it, in which case it's really not that bad.
So Bill, you mentioned earlier that you get a lot of Mamiya 6s and 7s. I think it's no secret to anybody here, Mamiya 7 is the best camera in the world, and I'll fight anybody to death on that one. But what are the kind of problems that do tend to come through on those?
Well, normally I see them when people buy them. They get a brand new Mamiya 7 and they say, I want to have it checked out. And I usually find rangefinder issues. The big thing is the lenses on those. The early lenses that Mamiya made from 95 to about 2000 often have separation in the elements. And that's what I see on the early lenses from the late 90s. Otherwise, they hold up pretty well unless you drop them. A lot of folks drop them, break the top covers, or plastic, of course, break bottom covers. But rangefinder issues are probably the biggest thing. They really are holding up pretty well.
You just have to calibrate them then?
Yeah, you calibrate it for infinity and 1 meter, and then of course for vertical. Usually if they get bumped or dropped, that usually causes the rangefinder to go off.
Gotcha.
And what about the electronics stuff? If the electronics go and that's it for those cameras, right?
That's not really that common.
Okay.
It really is. I mean, I've got a few in here that have bad electronics, but they've been water damaged. So if you don't water damage it, the electronics are probably the most reliable part of the camera, I think.
I guess that's all internet hype then.
Yeah, people get freaked out about electronics. They say, well, it's going to go bad. Not normally. It's usually switches or capacitors that go bad, but the electronics are holding up pretty well on those, I find.
I've owned 2 Mamiya 7s that have had some really serious issues, and I really wanted to talk about that for a second because, first of all, I want to say, of any camera I've ever owned, I can't think of any camera that had better optics, honestly. And I have like Hasselblad. The optics on those Mamiya 7 lenses is just stellar. Okay,
It's unbeatable.
It's incredible, especially the wide angle, the 43 millimeter. It was just incredible, But I had 2 of them where magnetic interlocks failed, and I sent them over to Bob over at Precision Camera, who had a Mamiya Legacy account. And after the second time repairing those, twice on 2 different cameras, and then also on one of my lenses, because they also have magnetic interlocks that fail. He said that he can no longer get parts from Mamiya. And then I literally traded. I had a Mamiya 7 kit with every single lens, even the weird one, the 200 millimeter one, whatever that, the 250. Yeah, that wasn't range finder coupled, which isn't very versatile, but I had it, and I traded that whole kit for a Noctilux 0.95, and then and I was done with it. I wanted to love them. And I paid like $3,000 or less for my first couple of kits, and now they're going for like insane amounts of money. But the electronic problems, I happen to be one of the ones that was plagued multiple times.
I don't know what the magnetic interlock is you're talking about. I'm not sure what
There's
that
these
issue is.
electromagnetic interlocks that are inside the cameras that control the shutter and the in the camera and in the lens.
The magnets, electromagnets. Okay.
Yeah. They're he called them magnetic interlocks. But anyways,
okay.
They failed.
Well, you know what? I replace those, but not that often. I don't see them fail that often. But I have them all. I have all the parts for those.
Yeah, I'm the unlucky guy.
Yeah.
Well, to step back let's step back 2 generations. And from there, we go back to the RB67, which was still 6x7, but fully mechanical. Are you still seeing many of those, Bill? How are they?
Oh, yeah. I see those constantly. The bodies hold up pretty well. The lenses need cleaning usually. But, we're talking about cameras that are 30 to 50 years old. And a lot of them are used professionally. So they've really held up pretty well. But I see the lenses quite regularly.
The thing I see on the lenses more than anything else, the shutters are pretty reliable, I think, as far as timing and all that. But they do have a tendency to get some haze buildup. And I don't know, maybe I've just been unlucky, but I've seen more of those with fungus than I do almost any other medium format lens. And I can't really explain it, but the quality of the camera was excellent. I mean, it held up well under heavy use.
Oh, yeah. Mostly replacing light seals on them these days, and that's all they need.
They were built as a very versatile camera too. Mind you, I have to mention that absolutely no one has held up an RB67 to the camera on this podcast today, which sort of tells you how
one here. I just can't lift it.
Oh, there you go.
Oh, there we go.
They're very versatile, especially with the rotating back and the back. Yeah, the different types of backs that you can actually get with them as well. I've got a full set with a lot of the lenses, and the things are tanks. They just keep working. I've never seen that fungus thing that you mentioned, Paul. Maybe you're buying the minus ones.
Yeah, no, it's just, I'm in Midwest Ohio, so we're in a hotbed here of high humidity summers. Anthony, Theo, is yours the Pro S? Because when I went to the
Pro SD,
it's the SD. Okay, so you got the more recent one.
Yeah, I got the recent one, and I've kind of stuck to the KL lenses, apart from the 50mm as well. So I've got the more recent lenses that can be used on the RZ as well.
Yeah, and it took care of your double exposure problems and everything else. But
yes,
the original RB67 was sort of like the Super 23 in that it didn't have a lot of interlocks. So it was very easy to do double exposures unintentionally. You cock the shutter and advance the film with two separate motions. It was possible to make an error there when you didn't mean to.
Bill, are the RBs themselves, are they very repairable?
Oh, I think they're going to be repairable for a long time. I mean, I have every part you could ever need for them, and I'm sure some other technicians do also, because they were such a popular camera. I know back in the 80s and 90s, I had wedding photographers that had just fleets of these things. So everybody kind of geared up for them, and Mamiya made parts available for them, unlike some other manufacturers. So I think they're going to be very repairable for a long time.
I think it's brilliant that they use graph lock backs. It's amazing because that's just such a common standard back, that you could use the same back thing that you could use on the same back that I could use it on my Graflex or on my Speed Graphic or my Crown Graphic. I thought that was great.
Can you use the graph lock backed roll film holders for Graflex on a Mamiya Press 23
with an adapter.
You can with adapters.
With adapter.
Yeah.
The disadvantage of that is your head's too far away from the rangefinder.
They don't have an extender for the eyepiece?
I haven't found one. If you can find one, let me know.
Because I know Graflex made one.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, the Super 23 actually came in two versions. Version for the M adapter, M backs, and the other version for the graph lock backs. If you bought a universal, you could use all of them, the M backs, the graph locks backs, because they had an interchangeable adapter in the back, but the Super 23 didn't. When you bought that, you had to specify either for graph lock backs or for M.
Right. On the universal, there were two silver plated buttons, chrome plated buttons that you pushed in.
Yep.
And that released the adapter. That's correct, isn't it, Bill?
Yep. The adapter came off, and you could put a Polaroid back on there, or a G adapter or an M adapter. So it was really probably the word universal is probably very apt for that camera.
It is. And I never really thought about it like that. But that's correct. The Super 23 only took the M adapter.
Or the G adapter, depending on what G backs, depending on what version you bought.
Okay.
Yeah, they sold it in two versions, with the G or the M.
Okay.
Is it worth explaining what all these adapters are to the listeners? Because we've touched on these adapters a little bit, and they're obviously used on the RBs and the press cameras. If I put it in a nutshell, and this is a layman's version of it, they basically allow you to attach different backs to those cameras, depending on what type of back it is, and the functionality around that back. And they can be very specific. Like I know there's a 6x8 adapter for the 6x8 back on the RB67 that you have to use, otherwise you're not going to get 6x8 frames, which I found out the hard way. But they also are interchangeable between to some extent between the press camera and the RB67. Is that a good summary of what those adapters are?
Yeah, the RB took the 120 Pro S backs or the Pro backs, and that was the same as the Graflex backs, like the RH8, RH12, the old backs. But it's just when you bought the press back, the bodies, you had to specify on a Super 23 whether you wanted to use the G adapters for the Graflex backs or the M adapter for the backs that Mamiya made. The M backs that Mamiya made were special for Mamiya. They didn't fit anything else. They were their own backs.
The advantage of the M backs were that you could get them up to 6x9.
Yeah.
Or you could get the K back, which was multi-format.
Right.
The Graflex RH8 was for 6x9.
Yep. That was, you could get either 6x6, 7, or 9.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a Graflex 6x9 roll film back. I think, is that the RH8? I can't remember.
RH8, yeah. There's a number of frames you got was the designation on the back. So an RH8 would be 8 frames and 6x9. A 10 would be 10 frames to 6x7, or 12 frames to 6x6.
Okay. So now take a totally different track. Mike, you were about to dive into the 35mm cameras earlier before I interrupted with the whole press discussion. Then we went off onto these medium formats. Is it worth going back and exploring some of that?
There's a lot of them, so I don't know that we would make sense to go over them all. But I mean, you have the highlights. I previously mentioned the magazine, which looks, if you just see it sitting by itself, it looks like a pretty generic rangefinder until you realize the entire back of the camera comes off. So you can swap rolls of film mid-roll without having to rewind it. You know, you could have black and white or color and switch the slide. You can flip-flop, you know, rolls of film without even having to finish the roll. So that was kind of cool.
Which model was that?
It's called the Mamiya magazine. It might be magazine 35. I had one once before. I couldn't get along with it, so I never actually reviewed it. But neat little camera.
I've got one here I can show.
Yeah, show a picture.
Yeah, get your big credit card out for one of those.
Yeah.
There you go.
Split
It
apart.
was a
yeah.
German camera. Had a
Adox.
similar
Adox.
concept. But I forgot the name of it now.
It was an Adox.
Right here.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, Adox.
Adox.
The difference is, though, the Adox works totally differently in that the magazine is contained within the camera. So the Adox still has a door that swings open, and then you pull the magazine out, kind of like the Kodak Extra does. Whereas the Mamiya, literally the entire, I mean, Mark, hold it up again. It looks like it's like a shell of the camera. You basically have the lens mount, and the viewfinder is its own piece. And then the entire rest of the camera is like, it's like splits in half. Whereas the Adox 300, the magazine just goes inside the camera.
Does the magazine, does it have a dark slide?
Yes.
It has to have a dark slide. How can you change
it has to.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how it works on that one. On the Adox, the key for it's got a twisting key lock on the bottom. When you twist this, it closes the dark slide automatically. So it's not like a Hasselblad where you have to slide something in and then not lose the dark slide. The dark slide is contained within the actual magazine itself. So it's pretty neat. But I get the impression, based on how rare these types of cameras are, Mamiya and Adox were answering a question that no one was asking. You know, there was limited appeal and wanting to swap 35mm. Mamiya created this little guy. This is called the Sketch. So this is a 24 by 24mm 35. So it shoots square image, basically robot size images, regular 35mm film. One oddity is, even though it shoots regular film and accepts regular cassettes, it cannot handle a 36 exposure cassette of film because it'll get stuck. Like the manual very specifically says they only went up to 20 back then, but I think a 24 would work. But
is that a rangefinder?
It is a rangefinder. Yep. It's got a coupled rangefinder. It essentially, I'll have a picture of this in the show notes. It essentially looks like a pretty normal Japanese rangefinder, just shorter. It's a lot narrower side to side. It shoots square images. It's got, a 3.5 centimeter Mamiya Secor f2.8 lens, film advance, coupled rangefinder. It's a pretty neat little camera, but these things did not sell well immediately. They had the unfortunate timing of going up against the Olympus pen, and the Olympus pen obviously was way more successful. So it essentially just fizzled probably within the first year of it being made.
How's the optics on the lens?
Excellent. Yeah, I loaded in my all-time favorite film is Kodak Panatomic X, which is razor sharp, super fine grain. I shot a roll of that in this thing, and literally picture the sharpest 35mm lens you can and just crop the edges off, and that's essentially what the image is that this thing puts out. So it was a small camera, but they did not skimp on quality. This camera cost significantly more than the pen did. I want to say it was over double, 24mm. So you didn't get quite the economy of half frame.
And that's called the Mamiya.
It's called the Sketch.
Sketch.
Yeah.
Speaking of half frame, though, they did actually do a half frame camera, Mamiya, the Mirapid.
That's rapid cassettes, though.
Yeah, it is, but it is a half frame. So
right.
they sort of were dipping their toes in all sorts of areas when they were doing that
Yeah.
kind of thing, and going for squares and half frames and so on. So, but that, I mean, this is an interesting little camera as well, but it's not rangefinder. It's not a rangefinder.
Probably Mamiya's most infamous 35mm cameras of that era would be the leaf shutter SLRs, the Prismat series. They made a dozen variations of the Prismat. It came in a whole crap load of lens mounts. You could get them in the exact amount. They made a version that had a proprietary lens mount with a weird bayonet. There's a version of that camera that was made for Argus. There's the Argus SLR is just a rebadged Mamiya Prismat. But once again, they made a whole new lens mount just for Argus that no other camera ever made. A variation of the Prismat became the Nicorex, the Nikon's leaf shutter SLRs. They made they had a whole bunch of different variations of it. I'm forgetting a couple there here, but
the Ricoh the Singlex was
the original Ricoh Singlex. Yep, that's another one too. So they pumped those things out, made a bunch of different kinds for different people, and then eventually they got into focal plane SLRs. One of the ones that I really liked was called the Auto XTL, which was a fairly advanced early 35mm SLR. It could do spot metering and averaging. Once again, its own proprietary lens mount. Late last year, I did a review of the Mamiya ZEX, which was part of the ZE series, and the X meant crossover auto exposure. You could pick any combination of exposure you want unless the camera disagreed with you, and it would just override whatever you picked. So it was probably like an early version of like programmed AE, or at least their take on it. I mean, they tried so many different things, between the press cameras, the medium format SLRs, the 23, the rangefinders, the TLRs with bellows, interchange, the 16s. Yeah, I didn't even touch upon those. I forgot about that. Mamiya made 16mm cameras too. Theo's got one. I know, Bob, you got a bunch of Mamiya 16.
Yeah, I've got a couple of them here. They're they seem to sort of, once they started, in any sort of camera, they just started variations after variation after variation. So they kind of try and do it. Yeah, they're nice ones, Bob. I can see those too.
I've even got the one made for Sears. It's the exact same camera. It's called a Tower. So they made it for other people too. So
yeah, I'm holding my my Tower 10B, which isn't working. I bought this one on Etsy, and they ended up giving me my money back and saying keep the money because it's the lever's locked. It was a special camera to me because the very first 35mm camera I ever owned when I was 13 years old was a Tower 10B, which I got for $20 from a friend of mine, and I used it to shoot yearbook for a while. So I bought this for nostalgic reasons, and maybe I'll send it in to get it fixed one day. Who knows?
Did you check the self timer on that?
There's a self timer on it? I don't think there's a self timer on it.
I don't know, but every time I get a camera with a jammed shutter, I try the self timer first because a lot of times that's what's wrong with it.
No, the shutter levers you could see is the winding lever is locked. I can unlock it by taking the bottom off, but then when I wind it again, it locks again. So I don't know what the problem is.
Is that the same as the rank Mamiya?
Yeah.
Is that the same camera that was sold in the UK?
This was sold by Sears, the Tower 10B.
Yeah, it looks very similar to the rank Mamiya, which is a very unfortunate name for a camera. But
got a great rangefinder patch, it's really nice. But
here's a bit of obscure Mamiya trivia. Mamiya made the Prismat NP, which has the Exacta, the Ihigi Exacta mount, right? But another prominent Japanese lens maker produced a lens for Mamiya using the Exacta mount. Who was it? It rhymes with Schmannen.
With what?
Canon.
Oh, Schmannen.
Canon produced an Exacta mount lens.
Yep.
It's called the OM. I don't know what that stands for, but it's not Olympus. It's an OM 50mm 1.9 lens in Exacta mount, but they made it for Mamiya. And Peter Deckert, everybody, I love Peter Deckert's rangefinder book, but less common, he actually made an SLR book too. Unlike the rangefinder book, it's freely published on the internet. You can Google it. I have it on my site. But the SLR book has a lot of cool trivia in it. And from the story I remember is that in the early 60s, a lot of Japanese companies were still struggling with distribution. poor distribution is the number one reason most Japanese companies like Aries and Miranda failed. But at the time, Canon and Mamiya had the same US distributor and obviously had some kind of agreement. So Canon made a lens for Mamiya, but using the exact amount.
Hey, Mike, I got
Yes.
an interesting Mamiya camera that not too many people have. Would you like to see it?
Sure.
Uh-huh.
Is that a gun camera?
Yep.
Oh.
So it's like a little pistol. Okay, that's neat.
Yeah, don't go out shooting that these days.
You wouldn't believe the problem I had getting this thing through customs.
Oh, yeah.
What film does it take, Ira?
It's 35 millimeter half frame.
Oh, wow. So I'd have thought that'd have been like 16.
Yeah, so did I.
Well, is it got a model? What's the name on it?
I think it's just called the Mamiya police gun.
Oh, okay.
Another piece of trivia, and I think Bob might know the answer to this one. We haven't really talked much about the 645s yet, but when you look at the lenses on the 645, the meter coupling uses a bunny ears, which to me look awfully like the ones.
It's exactly the same thing.
That sounds like a good story, Bob.
Well, Nikon had patented that, of course, in the early 60s when they came out with their first, well, actually in 57, they patented it because they were planning on having meters. Mamiya had a special relationship with Nikon. A lot of people don't know about the two owners. The guy, Mr. Mamiya, he actually knew most of the people at Nikon. And that's why they ended up making the Nicorx F for Nikon. Nikon didn't make it, Mamiya factory did. But also when the M645 first came out, I had one. And I picked it up the first day I got it. I look at it and I'm looking at that lens prong. It's exactly like the Nikon lens prong, which they had patented. So he had to get that permission to use that, and he did because they were on good terms. He did other things for Nikon too. They had a lot of stuff they worked on together. But yes, that Mamiya 645 has the Nikon meter prong on the top. Absolutely.
By the way, if anybody wants to see that Mamiya pistol camera, it's on page 648 in McCowan's.
Which edition? The most recent?
Well, 2005. Yeah.
Since you brought it up, what's the latest on the newest version? Ira, have you heard anything?
Sure, it's coming any day now.
Yeah.
Oh, great. That sounds imminent.
Get your orders in while you can.
Yeah. The reason I ask Ira is Jim McCown spent 3 days at your house?
Yeah.
3 days. So a good portion of the cameras that you see in Jim's guide are Ira's.
Or in the new ones.
Yeah. We did a segue into the 645s. I know that's a pretty popular one too. I'll admit I only have the one. I have the M645, an earlier one, but neat camera. It's essentially the same concept as like a Hasselblad kind of design, but as the name implies, 645. So you're getting a little more economy out of those rolls. I have both the 220 back and the 120 back. So when I do stumble upon some usable 220 film, that's a good camera to use it in because it's like getting 30. Actually, I think you only get 30 images.
Yeah. It rips you off. It only does 15 on the on a 20. Yeah. You can, by the way, if you want to use the 220 back with 120 film, you literally only have to remove one little tiny piece in the camera.
I've been doing that, Mike. What it does, it keeps the counter from going forward.
Exactly. It works perfectly. And I mean, it literally makes no difference.
So question for Bill about using 120 film on a 220 magazine is there's a difference between the 120 film not having backing and 220 film. Oh no, 120 film having backing and 220 film not having backing, which means the pressure plate difference of the focusing to the film plane should be different.
Correct. The pressure plate is slightly different.
Correct.
Exactly. You can use it and people do it all the time. It may be a little heavier winding.
Okay.
If you're putting the 120 film in a 220 back, but you can do it. Sure.
I actually checked that myself, and first of all, it made no difference in the image for sure. But also, the pressure plate has like a spring on it, right? It actually takes up the slack properly. So it really, honest to God, it made no difference whatsoever that I could notice when I was using it.
Yeah, let's step back one more generation then into 35. We have talked about the Mamiya 500 and 1000 DTLs, which were pretty much everyman cameras back in the early 60s. The 528 was fixed lens, and then the 500 and 1000 TLs were the M42 mount through the lens metering. This is like a Spotmatic, only everyman's camera.
Generic Pentax.
Yeah, they came out in May of 66, the TLs.
Okay, so the TL's in 66.
Yep.
Then the DTLs with the spot and averaging metering came out about 2 years later.
Yeah, October 67, the DTL came out, the 1000 DTL. And then about 4 months later, the 500 came out, the DTL.
And those were distributed in the US by Ponder and Best.
Correct.
Back in those days, which was Vivitar. It became Vivitar.
Right. Actually, the rarest of those cameras is the 2000 DTL.
Oh.
They made about 1,000 of those. That's it.
How many people are going on eBay right now to see if there's any? Let's see.
Yeah.
There's a couple of them. 950, 145.
Yeah, I've got a couple of them. They're kind of interesting cameras.
Are they all black? It looks
Yep.
like they're only black.
Yeah, they only made them in black.
So they went to a 2,000th of a second?
Yep, that's the
Okay.
only difference. Yeah.
I've got another piece of trivia regarding Mamiya lenses. You'll notice that a large number of Mamiya cameras, all the way until recent times, would be labeled Mamiya Sekor, Sekor. And for the longest time, I never really knew that Sekor name had any relevance. But if you go back to our earlier discussion about the Mamiya 6, we talked about how they came in a large number of shutter and lens combinations. If you go on camerawiki.com, there is a page credited to a guy named Dirk H.R. Spenneman, who has done a pretty good job of showing all the various differences between the pre and mid-war models. And there's like 8 or so different lenses, from Neocons, Tokyo Kogaku, Similars. We know that Olympus had Zuiko lenses. We talked earlier about Nippon Kogaku lenses being on Mamiya 6s. I've seen one with a Fuji lens. After the war, the Zuikos were very common too. There was another lens type that you'll see on a few of them that says Setagaya Koki Sekor. And the origination of the name Sekor comes from a factory that in 1947 Mamiya purchased to build their own lenses and their own shutters. So Setagaya Koki was owned by Mamiya, but they, I guess, operated as their own company or entity, I should say. And they would produce Sekor lenses. Sekor is short for Setagaya Koki. And in 1963, Setagaya Koki was officially merged into Mamiya, and they just became one company themselves. But that's why you'll see a huge number of Mamiya cameras, from the old folders to the 35mm SLRs to the TLRs, that will have lenses that say Mamiya Sekor. Sekor was originally a factory called Setagaya Koki, but it eventually became the brand of lenses that Mamiya used for a large number of their cameras. You know, there's some companies like Nikon that they had a particular market. You know, Lights has a particular market. You know, there's certain companies that, you know, if they did more than one line of cameras, they stayed in their lane though. Whereas Mamiya, I think, was just like, hey, we'll do everything. You know, they were game for everything. They even did rangefinders. I couldn't quickly grab it, but that's right here. They had the Super Deluxe. I know Ira has the better version of this one with the 1.5 lens. So you could get them with a 1.5, a 1.7, and a 2. It's just a fairly standard Japanese rangefinder, but, you know, fixed lens, so you can't actually swap the lens. You could just buy it with different combinations of lenses, but it's one of the few Japanese cameras that could be had with a f1.5 lens.
And all the aerodynamics of a brick.
Yeah, it's very, very heavy. It's about the same size as the Yashica Lynx, the 14. Very, very big, but excellent optics. I mean,
in terms of the company, like the ethos, like what you were just talking about, Mike, Mamiya really reminds me of Konica. Like, they would just throw stuff at the wall. They'd make weird things. If it didn't work, they'd just get rid of it, and they'd try and find these niche markets and then try and expand in these niche markets. They came up with some both of them really weird and interesting cameras, and they kind of, towards the end, they both kind of went down similar routes, and like becoming, the Mamiya kind of ended up becoming more towards the pro market than the consumer market, apart from the SLRs, what you're talking about. So it's really, interesting with all the different Japanese camera manufacturers. They all had their own kind of ethos. And to me, Konica and Mamiya kind of similar in terms of not being afraid to take risks.
Something that's unique about the Japanese camera industry that today sounds completely bizarre. Like today, Sony and Nikon and Canon and Panasonic, those companies are not going to help each other out. Chevy and Ford, they're not going to like build things for their competitors. But back then, the Japanese camera industry, everybody was helping everybody. Nippon Kogaku, Nikon made the shutter for the first Canon camera. They made lenses for everybody. Asahi made lenses for everybody. Olympus made lenses for everybody. In fact, probably a third of Japanese camera makers at one point was an optics company that made products for somebody else, Fuji, for example. And Mamiya kind of took that to the next level. They were willing to work with anybody. You know, they had that agreement with Canon. They obviously had multiple agreements with Nikon, with the Nikon, the Nikkor X, and then what Bob talked about with the bunny ears. You know, they had Fuji lenses on Mamiya 6s. I'm sure there's many other examples of this, but, you know, back then it wasn't out of the ordinary for two Japanese or multiple Japanese companies to cooperate with each other for the betterment of the industry. And I think that's at least partially why they kind of were doing a little bit of everything. You know, they kind of just wanted to get their name out there or help in any way they can. I mean, I'm kind of guessing here. I don't know if is Ray still here?
Yeah. Here's a fun fact for you. One of the founders of Mamiya America Corporation, his name was Henry Froelich. Henry was the person responsible for getting Konica imported into the US right after World War II. So that's the interesting fact is they both were asking about the market that they wanted to sell into. So they relied upon it made me smile when the comparison of Konica and Mamiya were similar companies. They have in the USA anyway, and I'm convinced they were relying upon advice from what the market would bear and what the market wanted. And Henry was a remarkable person that really launched Konica and was a success for bringing Mamiya into America. For the Pro series for sure. The early on he had nothing to do with, but perhaps he was a thorn in Konica's side at that point.
We were talking about Henry before we started, Bill.
Oh yeah, Henry was a remarkable man.
He was a good friend of mine, and he was one of those guys that you just always like to see him because he was really a link to the past of the photo industry in the U.S. I mean, he
absolutely.
He was very.
He formed a partnership with Berkey, right, in New York?
Yeah,
he did. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
He was president of Berkey.
So you would see, like, when you look, because I know Cheyenne does too. I love looking through old photo catalogs from the 50s and such. And you'll see a lot of Konica stuff in like Willoughby's and Peerless. Yep. You know, they were, Bob, we've talked before about how in the Midwest, I'm in Indiana, in the Midwest, there was still a lot more anti-Japanese feelings towards this kind of stuff. So you wouldn't as likely see Japanese brands in Chicago or St. Louis, but on the East and West Coast, a lot of these importers were much more open to bringing in some of those brands. So I think a lot of people who shopped at Willoughby's and Peerless, that was probably the first time they may have heard of or seen Konica.
With Mamiya going into the medium format and obviously being the professional type camera, Bill, you mentioned on your site that you will not work on the 645 autofocus. What's the reasoning behind that?
Reasoning is lack of parts. My parts are just about gone for the AF series. Interestingly enough, the AF series 645 was the only series that for service required special computer program and jigs to connect to the computer to transfer data.
Right.
That's the only one. Now I have that equipment, but I don't have the parts. So I can't do it anymore.
So I'm assuming that's also true with the Mamiya ZD, which was their first digital camera.
Correct. Yep.
Failed in the US market.
Yep. That's correct.
Was a ZD, was that a leaf back?
It was a leaf camera. Yes, it was a leaf.
Whole camera.
It was an integrated camera. So.
And what lens mount?
It was Mamiya. It was Mamiya 645.
645. Okay. All right.
It was much smaller than having the camera with a leaf back hanging out the back of it and then a battery back. It was a pretty neat system. It was like a really fat Mamiya 7. Think about it.
And what was the sensor size? Do you recall?
Just under 645.
Okay.
1.3 crop factor. So.
But that was big for the day.
Yes, it was.
That was actually a big sensor.
Yeah, it was.
Can I use the AF Mamiya lenses on my Pro TL? Will they fit on here? This is the manual one, the Pro TL, and I'm just wondering the AF lenses, would they fit on this one?
It does.
You cannot.
There's no aperture control either, so.
Okay, thanks.
You can reverse that. You can put your manual focus lenses on the AF body. Not mistaken. Yes.
Yes. Correct. Correct.
And I have to comment, Bob, I'm impressed. You've got wearing the Mamiya shirt and everything today. We're going to need a picture of that for the feed later because that's actually real commitment.
I've been really impressed with the accessories that listeners of this show have brought. He's got his shirt there. One of my favorites was when we did the Minolta episode. A guy had a Minolta disco record.
Yes.
So there's a lot of really cool ephemera that's out there.
I even have the Ilford with the warm tone papers, and they produced a CD, and it's got 4 different pieces of music on it. So sometimes when I'm in the darkroom, I can put in the Ilford warm tone CD.
It was a jazz sampler. I have it right here in my cabinet. My first Cedar Walton song was on that CD. Ray, do you remember the Mamiya T-shirt that they did for dealers that it was black and had I wouldn't even say she was scantily clad. I would say she was basically unclad. On the front of it, it was a black T-shirt with a purple lighting.
Yep.
Oh boy, if I could find.
Was it Nancy from the Miranda ads?
No, this was later than that, but it was a very interesting T-shirt, and I could have sold a lot of them if I could have got them. But,
unfortunately, my wife found it in my archives and decided to throw it away. The only thing I have left that's kind of cool, and I'm away on business. I was in Cincinnati this weekend, and I live near Cape Cod. Hope to be back by the end of the week. But it's a little fuzzy bear sticker that says, "I love Mamiya." It's from the 60s. I have one left of those. Is kind of like the cool little tchotchkes, if you would, that have no value, but yeah, that's kind of fun, you know?
I've got one of those too, Ray.
Okay, I'm bringing it back from scantily clad women on t-shirts and so on.
Mamiya.
Yes. One thing we did talk about 35 millimeters, the SLRs and half frames, but they also produced a series of compacts which are quite popular these days and hard to get hold of. I've got a Mamiya U here. I've got both the autofocus and the non-autofocus model here. The non-autofocus was almost a bit like the Olympus.
The XA?
XA2.
XA, thank you. So it's a bit of a competitor to that. And it's a great little camera.
They made that in a silver version, I think, with the...
That's the autofocus.
It also came in red, didn't it?
In red, yes.
Yeah. I've seen them in red.
There was an accessory for that camera too. Wasn't it Marcy? Did Marcy have the accessory for that camera?
She did.
Yes, that's leading into that.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to see. Hold it up, Marcy, so we can see it. And then we got to get a picture of it.
It's legs, right?
It's hands, a lot of hands.
Okay.
And little feet turn, and it makes it tilt up and down. I know. And then you pull the little soles off the feet, and they hold batteries, a spare set of batteries.
Cool.
Oh, that is cool.
Brilliant.
I have no idea. I mean, it's not very, wow. How come I can't just tilt it up and down myself? I guess I can't.
Yeah, but it's not nearly as cool as that.
Well, yeah, that's true. And then it's got a little flip on the back, like for your belt or whatever, and it's, it screws into the tripod mount, and it fits the camera perfectly. So it was made for this camera.
Want to trade for a t-shirt?
So I can't find it. I found one on the internet for sale for $888.99, and I didn't buy it, but I wanted it. They called it Hand Sam, and I don't know if that's what the person selling it called it or if that's the name. So I'm going with hand Sam.
I think that was probably designed so that you could get your kids to look at the camera when you're taking their picture.
Maybe.
I'm sure that would, because, I can imagine kids are like, what is that,
Now, Marcy, I've got a question for you. With your Mamiya U there,
yeah,
is the shutter button intact?
No, it's it works, but it's the typical, the red is on, but it totally works.
Yeah, same here. They seem to all have that problem.
Yeah. But yeah, other than that, it's great.
Maybe you should ask Bill if he's got spare parts on those.
I've got most parts for the Mamiya U, believe it or not.
Really?
Ooh,
Yeah.
I might be hitting you up for
Yeah.
the shutter button.
Yeah.
Hey, Bill, I got an off the cuff question for you because I never got the answer. But when we discontinued Mamiya, did you buy parts directly from us or did you buy it from secondary source?
When was this? After 2014 or?
I think right around 2014. Yeah.
Well, I have all of Mac's parts, the 35 parts.
Okay.
The other parts I bought through, I didn't buy them anymore, of course, through after 2014.
Sure.
But I bought them through secondary sources.
The reason why I asked is because that was about the same time frame we actually moved warehouses to a bigger facility, and the parts warehouse is about as big as a average grocery store now, and the amount of Mamiya parts we have was just massive, just unbelievably, in what we had in stock for parts. Just incredible. Think about all the cameras over the years on every model, and the amount ordering from Japan. Just more curiosity. I never get out of the office.
I've got those parts now in my storage unit.
Cool.
And they're in boxes that are written in Japanese, and they're really, and they have a half-inch of dust on the boxes.
For sure.
I haven't inventoried them in years, but yeah, I do have all those parts, unfortunately.
Well, hope springs eternal, as I say.
Yeah.
So since you brought up sort of Mamiya's demise, it seemed like the first leg fell in 83, maybe 84. The company went bankrupt. They ended all 35mm production. That's why the U really never made it much past that. They stopped making SLRs. I think by then they weren't doing the TLRs anymore. And then from that point forward, they focused on just the RB 67 and the 645s. Is that right?
The 645, the RZ, but then they were soon after dealing with adding digital backs on with Leaf, and then they got invested with Leaf. The direction, or even think about the values going back 10 years ago on what a 645 was worth or a Hasselblad was worth. You couldn't give them away, and looking to see what the values are today. I even joked with the owner of Mac Group and said, maybe it's time we have a reinvent and, have one of our partners in China remake a manual 645 camera. And he's like, you're crazy. This is a fad. And I fully believe that there's a market for a brand new $2,000 mechanical camera that doesn't have to be made as well.
That's a topic that comes up constantly. We've discussed it on this show. What would it need to be? How expensive could it be? Because if it's too cheap, then it's just no one's going to, it's not going to be a serious camera. If it's too expensive, it's unobtainium,
Leica's still in business for a reason, aren't they?
Yep. Yeah, I've been friends with Bellamy Hunt in Japan over 10 years, and we dipped in and out of that process of making a new mechanical camera, and I got in touch with a whole stack of camera companies, and basically that all died off except for the real high-end stuff, and the cheap stuff's all made in China. And the problem is, I think we've discussed it on Mike's podcast once before, we're talking about repairs, and camera companies we're talking like Mamiya, they would have had a production line running, and so they could set aside a certain amount of people, and it's all the machining and tooling. It's incredibly expensive to make all the little bits and bobs of a camera. And when you've got what often they did was they take little bits and pieces for another camera, incorporate it all together to cut down. But when you start from scratch, like a mechanical camera, it's just incredibly expensive. I think, I'm not sure if it was Mike's podcast when they made the reproduction of the the Nikon S3, you know, the rangefinder, the classic one. That was like incredibly expensive because firstly they had to make all the machinery and then they had to get all the old technicians how to put it all together. That kind of gives you an idea of like why it's just so difficult. The actual knowledge, the people who knew how to make all the little bits and bobs and the machinery and everything has just kind of disappeared.
For the amount of demand right now that exists for film, whether you're talking 35mm or medium format, whatever that number is, part of the biggest obstacle, I think, towards their need coming out with something new is that all these old cameras still work.
And they last forever.
It's going to be a really, really tough sell for me to consider spending $2,000, let's just say, on a brand new Nikon. Let's say they were to come out, let's say they came out with an FM4, or whatever. And let's say it cost $2,000. Or I could just pick up a used Nicorex or Nickermat, I mean, you know what I mean? For $50. So I know that's apples to oranges, but for the people who just want to casually shoot, I think there's still too many options for the classic camera.
You're right.
I envision that it's going to be. I can't really see in any large amount. I mean, you have Leica that's still producing cameras and very nice cameras.
Well, that's a boutique. They're a boutique.
That's a boutique item, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what's going to probably happen is, and this is what I'm envisioning, is that you're starting to see a lot more, or like, for example, things that were unrepairable. You're starting to see a lot of Asian places now that can, like, for example, fix like the electronics on Contax T-series cameras, T3s or something like that, which, were unrepairable at one time. I think what's going to happen, and China, for example, you have them make Light Lens Lab, for example, those companies, they're making really high quality Leica M glass. I think somebody in China, for example, is going to probably say the market's probably big enough and maybe start making parts again for some of these cameras that exist today that are, where parts don't exist. Because you're right, Mike, there are still millions and millions and millions of very well-made cameras on the market, but the issue is parts, right? And I think that there could be a market for parts.
Sure, I agree.
I also get annoyed with the argument sometimes where someone will say, well, Nikon, Canon, and others are still making cameras. Why can't, it wouldn't be hard to just adapt it and make a film back on those camera design? Yeah, yes, the machinery is there, but to actually readjust that machinery takes millions of dollars worth of R&D and design to actually even adjust existing machinery. So producing something new completely for a market that is also flooded with a lot of used equipment that works just doesn't make any economical sense in a lot of cases.
Well, I'll give you a really interesting thing. Fuji wanted to get out of the film business. Their Instax film, like, they wanted to get rid of it. Bellamy and we were trying to buy their peel apart when they were going to get rid of it. And in the end, they just said, no, we don't want to promote film anymore. We're actually going to destroy the machinery rather than sell it to you. They wanted to get into other things. And the Instax film, despite their best efforts, became like this huge phenomenon, and they had to keep producing it, but they didn't want to. So even something that does make them money, film is seen as an anachronism, and like they just see that as like going backwards. Yeah. I think it's going to take somebody who's got a real bit of vision, like Doc Capps, who rescued Impossible Project. There's very few people that have got the nous, the money, that can see it to like create something, like to create a new film camera. There's been a few efforts recently, and they've all, despite the best intentions, not been successful. The only thing that's really done really well is that they're making the cameras, like the 3D printed cameras that you can fit the old lenses on. And that's a really cool idea. So you can give, at least the lenses will still have like a second lease of life.
Well, I was thinking about what Ray was just saying about making a 120 SLR. Mamiya at the end of the line, one of the last cameras they made in the 645 series was called the E camera. And it had a fixed prism that was like, I don't know how to describe it. The the prism had a tube that came off the back of it. It was not interchangeable. It was a fixed prism. It was very, very simple. And I think it retailed with a lens for $11.99. So it was quite reasonable considering, back in that day.
Sure.
Those cameras, I could see them coming out with something like that.
Yeah, that's what I was inferring to. It's like an E camera.
Yep, something that would use, because there are so many lenses out there for the Mamiya 645. So many lenses that are with the prism issues on the 645 cameras now. I actually think that would be a saleable product.
Yeah.
That sort of kicked off thought here too, Paul. The reusable lenses, those press lenses are being used in almost every 3D printed camera that's coming out recently.
The panoramics.
Well, on a lot of them, the chroma cams and all those. The thing is that they really only work well with the wide angles because they're not any kind of rangefinder focus. So the wide angles are the ones that they primarily fit, though.
Yeah.
I have seen some that will take the 100mm lens.
What's the panoramic camera that uses the Mamiya wide angle lenses?
Yeah, Dora Goodman.
Dora Goodman, that's right. Yeah, Dora Goodman, I know you could buy many cameras, and then you just have to have your own, lens and shutter.
65mm.
That's it. That's the one I was thinking of. Yep.
Well, the Chroma makes one that's actually a 6x12.
Yeah.
And it will work with the 50mm Mamiya press lens will actually cover 6x12.
Yeah.
So that's pretty cool.
We're at the 100-minute mark. We still have quite a few people here. We've lost a couple, which is completely understandable. Is there anybody that has any questions that didn't get a chance to speak or ask that they wanted to bring up regarding Mamiya or I guess anything?
I have a weird camera to show.
Go ahead, Stephen.
It's a 3D world camera.
Awesome.
Modified with 55mm Mamiya lenses so that you could shoot wide angle stereo.
That's
Holy
cool.
Cow. What's that called?
This was the 3D world camera that was made in China in 2008, 2009. And originally it had 80mm Chinese planar copies.
Holy cow.
Yeah. So actually I have an original one here too. It's
Well, I'll describe it real quick. Stephen, you're gonna have to send us a picture of that.
okay. So here's the original one with the Chinese planar copies. So what some of us started doing was to get a wide angle version. We would take the Mamiya lenses from the C series. So this is 55mm lenses. These boards were made by a guy named John Thurston, and then you'd get your own lenses to fit.
So let me describe it real quick. This thing is a huge triangular shaped camera is there a waist level finder on top?
It will actually fit all the Hasselblad accessories. So
okay.
You can put a Hasselblad waist level finder or a prism. And this is the original prism.
So you have right below the prism is a viewing lens, and then below that are twin taking lenses. So
That's correct.
It looks like a triple lens. In fact, when you first held it up, I thought it was one of those turret cameras, where you rotate it. But that is neat. Wow.
Right. I also inherited another project that's only half done. I'd like to find somebody that could complete it. Somebody Siamese two Mamiya flexes. And they tried to make it so that this one knob would advance the film at the same time between the two, but it doesn't quite work. So I just stick with the other one, with the 3D World one.
One of those sold at the Ohio Camera Collectors auction last year.
Oh yeah,
I think Igor bought it. It was brand new in the box. It was the only one I've ever seen.
Right.
Very
yeah,
cool.
I still have the box and all the mounting jig and all that stuff downstairs. Yeah. It was really funny because when you originally ordered those 3D World cameras, the only payment they would take was Western Union. So and that's like the biggest scam that's going, right? So somebody in China is telling you have to send a couple $1,000s via Western Union, right?
Wow.
And then your money's gone and you just sort of wait and hope that it shows up.
You brought up the Ohio auctions, and for my own personal curiosity, Ray, did the Konica sell?
I chose not to sell it yet, but I've got 20 people in line waving big numbers, and I don't know if I'm going to sell it. I'm having second thoughts that I might want to hold on to it.
I'd really love to do a review of that one. So
Yeah, Cleveland was interesting. Cincinnati was a really good show. It reminded me of a show 25 years ago. It was
Wow.
very well attended. There were people buying, selling, trading. Everyone was happy. It was really a good thing.
We did a Gray Flex episode 2 back, and I wasn't there because I was sick. And we had the highest number of listeners of any previous show. So the first episode I don't show up to is the most popular. I know Paul didn't go to this show too, so maybe his absence. No, I'm just kidding.
No,
Yeah, I was looking for him.
that's okay, Mike. Go ahead. Ray told me what a great show it was, and Igor called yesterday to tell me what a wonderful time he had, and how he spent a lot of money with Ray, and it was just wonderful. And it was so sad that I wasn't there.
I don't want to say this, but I'll say this because he's a great guy. Igor came up to me and said, "Oh crap, the banks are closed for tomorrow."
Money.
He ran out of money, and that's almost impossible. I felt really good. He was all set for the next day, though. But that's something for a person. He's a professional buyer. Great guy. In person, I've known him now for 25 years, and I don't think I know one person that knows as much about everything. He knows just about everything, of every brand, of every format, of every condition. And
You're going to get him on the podcast, Mike.
Well, it's funny because the last time I saw him was at the Chicago show, and I was wearing my Camerosity Podcast shirt. And he walks up to me. He goes, "Oh, that's Paul Ryboat's podcast." I'm like, "Yeah, it's Paul's." Nick Marshall, I don't think we've heard from you. Do you have any questions, or are you just a fly on the wall here?
I'm just a big Mamiya fan. I mean, I got into the medium format cameras specifically because I love pack film so much. So I got the Universal because it shoots full frame pack film, and then also the RB67 because it shoots most of a full frame of pack film. And one of the interesting backs, I mean, there's RB67 is kind of a special camera as far as instant film shooters go, because there's so much room on the back because the rotating adapter gives you, a bunch of room. So it's been able to, people have been able to adapt quite a lot of different instant backs for it. Like you can get an Instax square back for it. You can get an integral back that shoots like 600 or SX70 film. One of the backs that's very cool for that is made by Arca Swiss, and it shoots half of a frame of pack film, and then you slide it over to the side, and then it shoots a second half of it. So you can actually get two kind of vertical rectangles. It's like a sliding double exposure back. So there's quite a lot of interesting Polaroid backs. That's mainly what I got into the Mamiya cameras for.
Hey, Nick, with the RZ 6x7, they also made a quadra back that shot 7.2 square.
Yeah, that one uses like a larger, it's kind of like a 545 sheet film back.
Sheet film, yes.
Yeah, so then you're using these days that film is quite a bit more expensive. So I never got into those. I think I think there was a quadra back for the RB67 also.
No, this is RZ.
Okay.
I shot a ton of 55, which is the positive negative film for the negative.
Yeah, but as far as cost wise, I never even looked into that because the pack film was always cheaper than the 4x5 sheet film. And for something like that, you would maybe shoot 665 pack film. Yeah, no, there's a lot of the Polaroid people that I know, or people are very enthusiastic about instant film, got into RB67s. Even nowadays, Policon just over a week ago, I saw a lot of people with RB67s with different kinds of instant backs on those.
Cool.
All right, well, thanks for coming on, Nick. Real quick, Mark posted in the chat on the magazine 35, the dark slide automatically closes when you unlock the magazine. So similar to the ADOX. So much information, stuff that I didn't know. I love the history parts of it. I love hearing the stories, having Ray and Bill here and sharing your stories. Bill, was there anything else you wanted to talk about, or quick anecdotes that you think are worthwhile?
No, I think I've had as much fun as I can handle.
Can I plug a show? Camera show?
Sure.
Oh, the local camera club, or the Puget Sound Camera Collectors Society here. They're having an April 1st in Kent.
Where are you at?
In Kent, it's in Kent, Washington. Sorry.
Kent, Washington. Okay, sweet, awesome. Well, anybody listening in Kent, Washington, are you going to be selling there or just buying?
Oh no, neither. I'll be helping out.
All right. This just in from the Camerosity Podcast news desk is breaking news. With us on location is Theo Panagopoulos.
Hey everyone! Hey, look! It looks like there's some news coming through on the package. Anthony's back on the line. What's going on, Anthony?
It's a Camerosity miracle. I'm absolutely flabbergasted. Today, some kind couple apparently found the box with the Superb had fallen off of the mail truck and was sitting on the side of the road in the rain, smashed up. The box was smashed up, and it was barely legible that it was to be delivered to Volta. But after almost a month, 22 days, 21 days, they came by and just dropped it off with the baristas and said, "I think this belongs to you," and left. They wouldn't even accept a latte in gratitude. They were just so kind and nice to be able to bring it back. I mean, it literally fell off the back of the truck.
So it was just sitting there on the side of the road?
As I understand it. And certainly looking at the condition of the box, which is soaked through, you can see that the cardboard is rippled from it being soaking wet. The contents inside were completely drenched.
Oh, that sucks. So the camera's destroyed.
Well, I was worried about that, but luckily Theo is the king of shipping cameras.
Hail to the king, baby.
And he has learned his lessons over the years. And inside this rather large Australia Post box was a smaller box that also had bubble wrap. And inside the bubble wrap was an industrial freezer grade Ziploc bag. And inside the Ziploc bag was a Voigtlander Superb packed with little desiccant packets to keep it dry. And somehow that inner box survived a month just being battered by the elements. And I'm scanning negatives now and they look superb.
Good on you, Theo. So you double boxed it. You put the Superb in a box, and then that box wrapped in, what was it wrapped in, you said?
More bubble wrap.
More bubble wrap.
Don't forget, around that little box was Twisties, Tim Tams,
Vegemite,
and I think some Violet Crumbles.
I think you owe it all to the Vegemite.
Yeah, that's what I would think. If you slather anything in Vegemite, it can survive that.
I mean, I'm sure that all the candies and all got soaked, but they're still in their original packaging, and none of that was compromised.
Wow.
So no fire ants in the Twisties.
Your staff tried to offer the people free coffee, and they declined. They just left.
Just were like, this
Wow.
just belongs here, and they left. And I don't know if anybody had tried to open the box. I mean, the one end was completely burst open, and somebody had sort of half-heartedly wrapped it with masking tape to sort of keep the end from falling off. And I don't know if that was the post office. I don't know how much of the damage was done before before it fell off the back of the truck, because it was sort of lost without tracking in the U.S. Post Office system for, what was that, 3 weeks for it to cross the country? 3 or 4 weeks for it to cross the country.
Yeah.
So, hey, you finally got your Superb. That's awesome. I mean, it was a weird story, but for it to just show up, like, let's say the post office found it, that would have been great. But this is a way cooler story.
It is. It's pretty fantastic. There's a lot of good karma behind this. And on top of that, just did an absolute spectacular job on fixing this thing up. Looking into the ground glass, it's as bright as pretty much as my Rolleiflex is. And I love it's got the little tiny mirror with the backwards number, so you can see the shutter speeds from above in the right direction. And I just ran a test roll of some macros on it, tried all the shutter speeds, tried all the aperture settings, and I got 12 out of 12 shots out of it.
Wow.
Cool.
So the camera is in perfect working order. No issues with shutter, no issues with the aperture, no issues with the film transport.
All right, let's see some scans. Pictures on the website.
I just literally scanned the first frame while we were talking. So
Cool.
I'll have scans up tonight. And this is such a happy solution to this rather terrifying nightmare. And like I said, the post office still thinks it's lost. So I think I'll let them sweat that.
Let them think it.
I'll let them sweat that one out for a bit longer. See if they want to come up with a resolution.
Yeah, I mean, realistically, they didn't find it, so it's still true that they lost your package. That hasn't changed.
They absolutely. I mean, the frustrating thing to me is that in Gainesville we have a regional post office that's like a distribution office, and it's 5 blocks from the delivery address. It's 3 blocks from my bakery. I can almost see it from my second floor window. and they scanned it in, and then it just vanished. And I had pretty extensive discussions with the carrier, and her take was that if it was on the truck, it absolutely would have been scanned, and it absolutely would have had a signature. So the fact that it was neither scanned nor signed for, it just fell off the truck, literally.
Well, Anthony, I'm glad you got your camera. You had wanted one for way before even Jess got her hands on this one. That was like your white whale, and for it to have gone through this story, plus the money you had invested in it, to begin with, the CLA, the shipping, all that. So happy ending.
Absolutely. It's crazy story. It's been a camera that I've been, trying to land one now for probably 5 or 6 years. And for it to end up like this, it's pretty amazing.
Stay tuned for the next Camerosity miracle.
I want to thank everybody for coming. This is the 45th episode of the Camerosity Podcast, and it's taken us this long. We have done as good of a job as we possibly can delaying the inevitable, something that I didn't think would ever happen. But for our next show, we are going completely digital. We're going to have a digicam, a digital camera, digital everything. So we're going to try and do no film. There's a good chance that won't happen, though. So I guess we'll have to see. But we're going to have a guest robot Theo host is going to try and keep us in line and shoot electrodes through the Zoom to keep us in line. So we're going to record episode 46, April 3rd. That is 2 days after April Fool's Day, by the way. But we're going to be doing a digital show. So anything, whether it's the point and shoots, whether it's digital mirrorless, whether it's vintage digital, Theo and I are both working on full reviews of 2 very old DSLRs from the 90s. I'm pretty much done with mine, Theo. Where are you at on yours?
Not done. Let's just call
it done. Okay. All right. We'll talk about some vintage digital, maybe some of the old video disc cameras. Who knows how that's going to go? It should be fun, though. After that, we have some ideas for shows coming up. I definitely want to do a Konica episode. I really want to talk about Yashica one of these days, too. Anything's on the table. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we just talked with Dan Tamarkin about auctioning cameras and just what's going on there. Does anybody have anything else they wanted to point out before we leave?
I just actually wanted to say that I'm really looking forward to your review of the Mamiya 6, because for many cameras that you've reviewed, you've actually become the definitive source for the information. Between you and Ken Rockwell, it's pretty much where I go to when I want to find out anything in depth about a camera, because you go into so much history. And the Mamiya 6, it's really hard to find information about them. You really have to scour the internet, and there was not much written about them, even though there's so many of them still available, and there's such amazing cameras.
Quick funny story about that. When I bought the Mamiya 6 folder for the first time, mine has this extra, it's on this side, this extra lever that was not in any of the manuals on Butkus.
Yep.
I could not find a single post about it anywhere. And ultimately, I found a video in Japanese that demonstrated how you click that to start the automatic stopping for winding. You have to do it after you've already lined up the first frame with the red window. So it's a difficult topic if you have a weird one.
And especially if you have the Mamiya 6 V, which is an automat that has 2 different counters on it.
That's nominally what this is.
Yeah, and Mike, when you get it, if you can't figure it out, because I know you're pretty scrappy, but if you can't, please contact me, because it takes a while to figure out sometimes how to get those things operational, because it's hard to find a manual for any of those cameras.
Also, pro tip: loading the dark slide or the film back plane in upside down is not a good idea.
I've done that before.
Although you will still get photos. It works surprisingly well upside down.
No, I did all the research for my article. I just need a working copy of a Mamiya 6, and I might be able to publish it one day.
Awesome. I'm looking for it. Cheyenne has some pretty good articles too. You do about one a year though, so.
Yeah, I'm like, no, I can't match your standard, buddy. And the podcast. I'm like, when do you get to see your kids?
Sometimes. right. Well, this is great. Fascinating. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everybody who joined. Bob's still here. Andrew Smith, Brian, Greg, Ira, Nick, Marshall, Marcy. Always good to see you. Chris, Ray, Mike Amati, Steve Liederman, Mark Faulkner, of course. It's always good to see you. Bill Rogers. We lost Anthony, a few other people too. So until next time, we will see you.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
The brand new, ultra powerful, magnificent Mamiya 645 Super. Its haunting visage. It's lightweight, but don't get greedy. Its delicate curves. Speaking of delicate, it's also mostly plastic. Its detachable backs make it where you can be indecisive, loading multiple color and black and white film rolls, depending on what you have and how much money you have. Same with the lenses and other stuff that does things. War photography mostly. It's mostly intuitive. Even a hand model can put it together. It's like an infinity gauntlet of amazing features. Look at that bright screen. The Mamiya 645 Super. It will haunt your dreams.